What is the state? How does it preserve itself? What does it fear? These are the questions Murray Rothbard uncovers in his powerful book, Anatomy of the State. Thanks to our generous donors, the Mises Institute is offering a free copy of this Rothbard classic to Human Action Podcast listeners. Get your copy at mises.org/HAPod free. That's HA like human action, pod free. This is the Human Action Podcast, where we debunk the economic, political, and even cultural myths of the days. Here's your host, Dr. Bob Murphy.
Nicolás, welcome to the Human Action Podcast.
Hi, Bob. Nice to see you again. It's been a while.
Yes, indeed. So for the benefit of our listeners who are not familiar with you, can you just explain your role in the Austrian movement and why you're an expert on the monetary and banking issues that we're going to discuss today?
Well, that's a journey. The reason is that my dad, he was an economist, and he studied in the U.S. under Hans Sennholz. Eventually, when I finished my undergraduate degree in Argentina, I moved to the U.S. to do my doctoral studies, and Ben Powell, he was my advisor back then. And since then, I've been around, these circles. My dissertation was on the business cycle theory. It was shortly after the 2008 crisis, so it was a timely topic at the time. And just to put it shortly, it was, in the old days, when you think about the business cycle theory, you have a gold standard regime or something of that sort. But now today, in this world, we have fiat currency. So, for instance, you have an exchange rate to think about. And that can be another price that, sets you off if you put it out of equilibrium and all these issues. And after that, I start looking at monetary policy topics like, why Selgin idea of NGDP targeting, market monetarism was also relevant at the time. And that was, the work I found myself in. I think the reason we're here today is related, but a little different because it's more policy related. And it has to do with the presidential election in Argentina. As your audience may know, Javier Milei is now president-elect. He is about to take office on December 10. And one of his more popular proposals is to dollarize and shut down the Argentine Central Bank. So if you look at Latin America, you have three key countries that don't have their own currency, and they use the US dollar as their currency. Panama, which has been dollarized since independence in 1903, I think. So they have been using the dollar for more than 100 years. And then you have El Salvador and Ecuador, who dollarized in 2000, 2001. So these are two larger countries than Panama with 20 plus years of being dollarized. And so the proposal for Argentina includes something similar. Eliminate the peso, shut down the central bank, and start using the US dollar as your legal tender currency.
Okay. Can I just jump in just for the benefit of our listeners here? So you actually wrote a specific proposal with a co-author, right?
So that was my next point.
Mm-hmm.
Starting in 2020, I've been working with an Argentine economist, Emilio Campo, to develop a proposal of where we discuss why and how Argentina could be dollarized. And this was before Milei was even a presidential candidate. And it happened to be that at the time the book was about to come out, this book is in Spanish, written for Argentina. At the time the book was about to come out, Milei, now a presidential candidate, he says, if I win the election, I'm going to dollarize. The topic became very popular in Argentina. And the next week, the book was coming out in the shops. Total accident. And I think 2 or 3 months after that, Milei says, well, I'm going to dollarize following the proposal of Ocampo and Cachanosky. So our book and our work became even more relevant in that sense. So since then, we've been, presenting the proposal, updating the proposal, talking about dollarization and all these issues. And now that Milei won the elections with a significant difference against the other candidate, now it becomes more real that Argentina may actually try to dollarize. And an important reason for that is that my co-author, Emilio Campo, he's been publicly mentioned by Milei to be the next and last central bank president of Argentina. So the idea is for him to be appointed with the objective to dollarize and shut down the Argentine central bank. And if that's still on the table, that may, be put in motion in December.
Okay, well, great. Thank you for that quick summary. And then we'll, of course, folks, dive into the details here. Nicolás, can I just ask you, though, for people who don't read Spanish, your economic order Substack here called How to Dollarize Argentina that you released on October 9th of 2023, is that a fair summary of what the plan is?
Yes, something we did shortly after the book came out was start a blog in Spanish where we engaged the debate about dollarization, the criticism. We maybe published some updates about the proposal that were needed because of the discussion on the topic or the economic situation in Argentina changes, so we need to adjust some parts of the proposal. As Milei was gaining, presence as a potential next president, the topic of dollarization started to gain international traction. So if you go to my blog, it's a Substack Economic Order. I translated many of my posts in Spanish into English, and one of the latest one is a pedagogical summary of how the dollarization will take place, which is the one you just mentioned. So how you deal with the currency circulation, how you deal with bank deposits, how you deal with central bank liabilities, and a few other items. And one of the items that I find that many people are interested is how you do it. I get that, why you want to dollarize, but how this happens. And the point of that post is to explain how we thought about this for Argentina.
Okay, great. Just another housekeeping thing, though, before we dive into some of these specifics, Nicolás. So for folks, for those of you who caught not too many episodes ago on here, the Human Action Podcast, my guest was Peter Lewin, and he was talking about, a lot of his work. He had a book come out, and his frequent co-author is Nicolás, who's we're now talking to. So in case you caught the episode with Peter Lewin, and we kept talking about his co-author who wasn't there in the interview, we've now filled that hole in your life. So Nicolás, before we get into your proposal, though, can you just explain, are there different meanings of, like, for example, Panama, El Salvador, and Ecuador are all dollarized. Is it all the exact same thing, or are there different types of institutional frameworks that people use that term to describe?
Right. Yes and no. So in very abstract general terms, dollarization is when a country uses other country's currency as its own. May that be the US dollar, the New Zealand dollar, the Australian dollar, the euro, not your currency, someone else. So dollarization in that sense is that general approach. In the case of Argentina, dollarization will be with the US dollar, mainly for two reasons. One, Argentina is already, if you want to, de facto dollarized. Argentines save in dollars. Some transactions are priced or made in dollars. Argentines don't want pesos. So the country is already standing over the US dollar. This is not about imposing the US dollar to the Argentines. It's letting them use the currency they already want. The other reason is that the Argentine government cannot issue international debt in pesos. They have to issue that in US dollars. So to avoid a currency mismatch, you want the government to collect in the same, the tax revenues to be the same currency they have to pay their liabilities, so that they don't have this uncertainty about what the government is going to do with the exchange rate.
Now, and Nicolás, just to clarify, when you say they can't issue debt right now in the international markets in their own pesos, you mean because nobody would take those bonds because it's depreciating?
Okay. The only way they can do that in the domestic market is basically like forcing it.
Right. Okay, so since if they want to go borrow money from abroad, it has to be denominated like in US dollars.
In US dollars. Now I'm the Argentine government. I need to pay this large amount of debt in dollars. I don't produce dollars. Where do I get them from? The public. So, for instance, if you export goods in Argentina, you sell them in the international market, and you have the obligation to submit your dollars to the government, and they will buy them from you and give you pesos. Because the government needs the dollars to pay the foreign debts, pay imports, and so on. So to avoid that problem, that's another reason why many economists think if Argentina is going to use another country's currency, that's a reason to pick the US dollar, to avoid that currency mismatch. Now, so the similar thing about dollarization is that you're using some other country, in this example, the US dollar, as your currency, with legal terms. If I pay you in dollars to cancel debt, it has that power. Now, the way the monetary institutions in place may be different. So in Panama, for instance, there is no central bank. In Ecuador and El Salvador, they are dollarized, but they still maintain their central bank. It's a central bank in name because they don't have the power to issue domestic currency. But they kept their central bank institution to do some financial regulation, managing emergency liquidity funds, and a few other things. But the entity is there. And in fact, that's not a minor issue. Zimbabwe dollarized in 2009. It kept the dollar as their currency for 10 years. And one of the reasons why they could de-dollarize was because they kept the central bank in place. And the central bank becomes the way the government steps back into the money market, says to the banks, give me the dollars, here's the new domestic currency, and they de-dollarize. Without the central bank in place, that's more difficult to do. Another difference, and this is one you have between Ecuador and El Salvador. In Ecuador, for instance, when they dollarized, the domestic currency, the sucre, had an expiration date, which I think it was like 9 months. So after 9 months, if you didn't change your sucres for US dollars, the sucres are not valid anymore. In El Salvador, it was different. The domestic currency, the colon, will never lose validity. So if you want to keep the colones, you can. You use them at the fixed exchange rate between the colones and the US dollar. And if you want to dollarize your colones, you make a bank deposit, which all the bank deposits are now in dollars. So I have the colon, I make a bank deposit, it becomes a dollar. Or you give it to the treasury in taxes, to pay your taxes in colones, and once they get into the bank system, that becomes dollarized. So they manage the currency circulation differently. But at the end of the day, you get a very similar situation. For the public, what matters is that their currency, unit of account, is the dollar or some other country currency.
Okay, well, great. So I think we got a good framework there and setup. So now, just specifically, how is this going to unfold? Milei appoints your co-author as the head of the central bank and says, do it. So how does it proceed?
Well, the way I try to explain this is to be pedagogical about this, is to separate what needs to be dollarized in 3 groups, or 3 buckets, if you want. One of them is bank deposits. Number 2 will be currency in circulation, the paste of papers I have in my wallet and the cash in my store and so on. Number 3 is the Argentine Central Bank liabilities. Each one of these 3, you can dollarize in different ways at different speeds, using more or less dollars. So the process of dollarizing a country, when you go into the details, can be very complex, or you may have a lot of different options how to do it. So I will go in order, from the fastest to the slowest one. The fastest one to dollarize is bank deposits. This is basically, if I may put it in these words, digital money in the bank computer. So one day I log into my bank account, and my peso balance has been dollarized to the equivalent in dollars at the dollarization rate. And here I want to mention that the rate you pick to dollarize is ideally what will be the equilibrium exchange rate between the peso and the dollar. So you want to dollarize at an equilibrium price. You don't want to dollarize two-way out, because that can be problematic. So conceptually speaking, if I'm in Argentina and my salary is paid in pesos, and I transform that into dollars, I get some number in dollars. If we dollarize, I need to get the same amount in dollars, right? Today in Argentina, you have a very highly restricted exchange rate market. So the official exchange rate is way off. It's like, a control price where you see the price, but the good is not there. You go to the store, there is a price ceiling, and yes, the price is $10, but the shelf is empty. So that's the problem you have today in Argentina. The dollar has a control price, so there's a large shortage, so you are not allowed to buy the dollars. The only way you can access that is through a financial market or the underground market. And that has a big spread. So that's a relevant exchange rate, the one that you can actually, buy the dollars. So bank accounts is the easy part, it's the conversion, and it's fast. Because once I log into my bank account, the dollars are there, or they're denominated in dollars. The bigger concern with this dollarization part is facing a bank run. The Argentine public will be afraid that the dollars are not at the banks, and they want dollars, not pesos. The central bank cannot print dollars, so they will run to the banks to withdraw the dollars, and I want my dollar cash to be safe. And so that's an important concern. If you look at the Argentine economy, I don't know how likely that scenario is there. And the main reason for that is that money is already out of the banks in Argentina. So if you look at bank deposits in Argentina, what you have is deposit for transactional reasons. I need to pay taxes, I need to pay my employees, I need to pay my grocery store, I need to pay the gym, and so on. So it's money I need in the banks because I need to make use of the payment network. So even if I take the money out, I'm going to put it back. Another reason is that you are dollarizing at the equilibrium rate. So it's not the current situation where the dollar is cheap. So if you dollarize at an equilibrium value, you shouldn't be facing the shortage, taking the dollars away from your pesos. I have pesos, I make a bank deposit to withdraw dollars. That's not going to be cheap anymore. So that will be stopped by the price mechanism. Another reason is what you see it happen in Ecuador. When Ecuador dollarizes, you see an inflow of dollars going to the banks. Ecuador dollarized in a similar situation to what Argentina has today, an economic crisis. They were getting out of a banking crisis, political crisis, all the problems. The banks were offering a negative real interest rate, and money was flowing back to the banks. And something that we miss sometimes is how profound an announcement that you are changing your currency is. That's a massive shock, a positive shock if you do this right. The announcement, not the law, the announcement of dollarization produced in Ecuador an inflow of money to the bank. Then you have other ways to deal with this. A bank who has a client who wants to withdraw dollars, well, instead of giving you the dollar bill, I give you, for instance, like a Visa card with the amount charged in the card. And this has two advantages. One is pragmatic because you don't have to be carrying the bills. You just have one card with the balance. And two, it's safer because now when I step out of the bank, I don't have people trying to rob me from the cash that I'm withdrawing from the bank because the card is harder to use if you don't have a PIN code or something like that. So that's something that banks can do. So overall, I would say to Argentina, well, if you're going to dollarize, pay attention to this problem, but don't just conclude that you're going to have a bank.
So Nick, let me just, and maybe you said this and I just missed it, so sorry, but either way, repetition could be helpful. So what is, the day before this reform, people have peso reserves at the banks, and then, a larger amount of outstanding checkable, demand deposits, right? Like, we call it fractional reserve banking. So,
yes.
Yep. Okay. So now they want to switch. So one thing is, how do they know the exact, the equilibrium exchange rate? Like, are they just guessing, or do they actually just take their reserves and just try to convert them literally into dollars and say, well, with this many pesos, let's go to the Forex market and how many dollars do we get? And then they just do the same.
Well, one quick answer is that you can look at the underground economy exchange rate, or what's called in Spanish in Argentina, the contado con liquidación, which basically is, well, I'm in Argentina, I'm going to buy, a stock and sell it in the US. The implied exchange rate might be a reference. So you can use that as where the exchange rate should be as a reference. Another option is that the government will have to, for some period of time, liberalize this exchange rate market and let the market tell you where that is. That's risky, and anything here is risky because Argentina is in a very delicate situation because the spread between the official rate and the underground economy rate, or the financial rate if you want, is very large. So you can have a very big jump on the exchange rate, and you want to put that under control as quickly as you can. But that's something that needs to happen whether you dollarize or you don't dollarize. The exchange rate is way off in Argentina. They don't have an option that to deal with that one way or another. The way I see this is that given that you have to make this, massive operation surgery your patient, the likelihood that you're going to minimize the cost is if you dollarize. Because that's the reform that has the potential to give you the most significant positive shock to bring confidence that this policy is not easy to revert. The government has to now keep with it. And that makes the potential cost of anything that needs to happen in Argentina lower. It's a reform I see with the lowest probability of failure. And that's something that Argentina cannot afford, another failure.
Right, yeah. So just to be clear, I'm not criticizing. I just want to understand exactly what the proposal is. So are they very quickly literally transforming their peso reserves into dollar reserves? Or is it just that's the nominal rate and now what they're showing their customers, but technically are they still...
I don't have an exact number on my head, but bank reserves of dollar accounts in Argentina are quite high. So what we just talked about, the bank accounts, if you know the balance is in your bank account, part of the realization process that you need to have the dollar cash for those reserves for withdrawals and stuff like that. So that you will need to handle. And that moves us to the second bucket, which is how you dollarize the currency in circulation. By currency, I mean loosely, like bills with physical existence.
Right.
And that can be in your wallet, but you need also these bills in the ATM of the bank because people will want to withdraw dollars at some point. So here the central bank needs to basically buy off the dollars and give you pesos. That's the concept. I mentioned already there are two ways to do this. I'm going to repeat them briefly and then mention something that Argentina can do. One way is to do a compulsory dollarization, which is the way Ecuador did this. So I give you a time frame to exchange your pesos for dollars. And after that, the peso loses validity. I mean, if you're an authorization, you're not going to have a long line at the central bank door of people with pesos to change them. So this is going to take time. Right? It doesn't happen overnight. In Ecuador, it was around 9 months. El Salvador offered a voluntary dollarization of the currency in circulation. So if you want to change the colones, you can. If you don't, that's okay. If you look at how long it took El Salvador to dollarize all its currency circulation, around 2 years. All right. For Argentina, given that the central bank has so little reserves, the Argentine central bank is basically bankrupt. And this is a problem, again, whether you dollarize or you don't dollarize, you need to do something with that central bank. You can start with Ecuador style and say, okay, I give you 9 months, 12 months, or whatever the time frame is, to dollarize your pesos if you want. And once this time frame happens, we see did the currency circulation fall beyond a certain threshold? And if it did, then you automatically kick like a Salvador style, a compulsory exchange. Okay, now the pesos remaining, you have to change them in, 9 month period or whatever that is. And that gives you a few advantages. One is you gain time because during the voluntary time, the central bank doesn't have to run and change all those pesos. Two, the amount of pesos you have to dollarize is less. So you have more time for the central bank to get hold of the dollars they need. Three, if you find yourself in El Salvador way, you eliminate completely the peso from Argentina and you make a stronger reform to stop the government from stepping back in and enforcing the peso into the public that they don't want to do that. Now, this is also relevant because once you look at the currency in circulation, if you go El Salvador way, you don't need all the equivalent dollars to dollarize that. Because you can say to the public, you want to dollarize? Make a bank deposit. or pay your taxes in pesos. Don't give it to me, the central bank. This is my peso, it's valid, I don't have to change it. When Ecuador dollarizes, compulsory, right? Like you have to change this. If you look at the currency in circulation, it starts to go down. If you look at the dollar reserves in the central bank, they remain flat. What increased was bank deposits in dollars. So you have basically two ways or two injection or absorption points when you dollarize. One is the central bank. The other one is private banks. So when people take their cash and put that in the bank, they become dollar bank accounts. And that's what happened in Ecuador. It's not only the central bank who dollarizes. You can use the banking system, if it's confident enough, to absorb these pesos. So this gives you a time frame. You have to dollarize overnight. It can save you how many dollars you need to do this if you start El Salvador way. The most difficult part to deal with is the central bank liabilities.
Can I stop you though for a second, Nicholas?
Yes.
So just for clarity, in your guys' actual proposal, did you specify whether it was, whether the peso was going to always be valid or not?
I think in the book that came out in last year, 2022, we mentioned the options, but we didn't put forward anyone in particular. The book was, one of the ideas of the book is, okay, this is your blueprint of how you do it. When you go from, I have the blueprint to I implement it, then you start to decide the details. Now, in between the book being written and the Argentine economy today, a lot of things change. So today I'm more inclined to start with El Salvador way instead of El Ecuador way, because the central bank is very, very short in dollars. But those are some of the moving parts that inside the same proposal you can adjust, to match your needs.
Oh, okay, but just to be clear, so right now, the fact that Milei, has publicly endorsed your guys' proposal, strictly speaking, it's not definite whether the Argentina peso is going to be valid currency 5 years from now.
I'm not working with Milei, and I don't have any details of how he wants to implement this in particular. Emilio's working with Milei, I'm not, and I don't know of any details between this is a proposal, but now we need to think about implementation, what changes are happening in between.
Okay. I'm just saying that when you're talking about the El Salvador versus the Ecuador, it's still an open question as far as you know as to which route.
As far as I know, it's still an open question. And I don't know if a decision is made.
Okay,
if it were me, given Argentine situation, I will consider start with El Salvador with a time frame to look at how much the public voluntarily dollarize, and if it's below a threshold, automatically kick an Ecuador case. So you can do that in dollarization law. You have this period of time where dollarization is voluntary, the peso is valid, but if by 1 year or whatever the time frame is, currency circulation fall by 2/3, then you have 9 months to change the remaining pesos.
Right, okay.
That would be my inclination probably today.
Okay, I got it. And then did you want to now move on to the central bank liabilities?
We can move to that. I would warn that this is the most difficult part, it's the most complex part, it's the one that we have the hardest time explaining, not because we are maybe doing something that has never done before, but we are doing something that is not common in Argentine financial markets because it's a small financial market, and it has never been used to dollarize a country. So this is the situation. If you look at the central bank balance sheet, the central bank has a portfolio of treasury bonds. And those treasury bonds are non-transferable. So the central bank cannot sell them to the market to perform a typical open market operation. So I want to withdraw peso from circulation. I cannot sell a treasury bond. I have to keep it. So what does the central bank do to perform open market operations? They issue their own bonds. It's a short liquidity bond called a liquidity bill or letra de liquidez. So I issue these liquidity bills. I give this to Argentine banks. They cannot be held outside Argentina, and you give me the pesos. The amount of liquidity bills outstanding is something like 4 times the base money. And this is denominated in pesos, a currency that no one wants. So the risk here is that if the market says, I don't want to hold this anymore, give me the pesos, you have a very serious problem. Right? It's all these 4 times the base money flooding into the market. And these equity bills are backing time deposits and bank accounts. So if you default them in any way, you can make a massive problem in Argentina. So when we think about this problem, we're trying to find a way to avoid that. How can we dollarize these liquidity bills without producing any type of default that can be a massive problem in the financial market? So I'm going to divide this in steps to organize the thought process. So step number 1 will be that the Treasury will perform a bond swap. So it will say to the central bank, give me that portfolio bonds that you have, and I'm going to issue new bonds under international law, where the amount of debt of these new bonds is equal to the amount of debt you are giving me. So I'm not increasing the amount of debt, I'm just changing the bonds. And we can have the same present value, so we keep the same profile of the bonds, but ideally, we increase the duration of the bond. They start to pay at longer periods. And the reason for that, not the only reason, but one reason is that if you're pushing forward these reforms, dollarization, and so on, you should expect to see a fall in the country risk premium for Argentina, which should make the market value of these bonds go up. So the higher the duration you have, the higher increase in this value you can have that you are going to need in Argentina when you do this. So step 1, I take the bond portfolios that the central bank has and I change that for bonds under international law. Step 2, I take these bonds and I don't sell them in the market to get dollars to buy out the LELIQs because I don't have a market to sell this. So what I'm going to do is put them at an international trust managed by an international entity. So this trust on its asset will have these bonds that the Treasury needs to start to pay. So this asset produces a cash flow, coupon payments, principal payments, and so on. That's step 1. Take these bonds, change them, put them in this international trust. Step 2, to minimize as much as you can the exposure to Argentine risk, the Treasury paying these bonds and not defaulting, we try to diversify the cash flow of this trust. So as much as the government is willing and it can provide other sources of dollars. For instance, and these are examples, you are an agricultural producer. Today in Argentina, when you export, you have to pay taxes. So part of those taxes, you have to send them to this trust, and the remaining to the Treasury. So now you provide to this trust a source of fresh cash that comes from exports, not from the Treasury. Another option is the government a few years ago nationalized all the private pension funds and retirement accounts. So that's a huge portfolio of stocks, bonds, and financial instruments that is there at some government office not doing much. So you can translate this to the trust that will produce dividends and coupons not coming from the Argentine government. And eventually, I will talk about this at the end of the process, that can go back to the same office if you want. So on the asset side of the trust, you have these Treasury bonds and these other contributions. What's in the liability side? All these liabilities from the central bank, the liquidity bills in pesos, they need to be dollarized. So now they become US dollar denominated liquidity bills issued not by the Argentine government, but by the international trust. A commercial paper, a short-term, zero coupon dollar-denominated bill. So I'm the trust, and from all these assets I have, let's say I get paid, $20. So now I go to my liabilities and say, okay, I cancel $20, I roll over 80. Next year I get 20. I cancel 20, I roll over the remaining. So this trust has one computer rule. Every dollar you get is a dollar you have to use to cancel your liabilities. At the end of the process, once all these, if you want, dollarized liquidity bills are canceled out, the trust self-liquidates and all its assets go back to the government. And all those treasury bonds that you have now become a debt cancellation. So this is the core of this process. It has an important advantage. Well, maybe a few, but one that is relevant is that Argentina is in a very complicated fiscal situation. So if now you say to the Treasury, those bonds that you gave to the central bank that you don't pay, you roll over, now you start to have paying them, that can be a problem. So that's the fiscal cost of dollarizing. So you have two ways to help the Treasury with this problem. One is when you make this bond swap, I take the central bank bonds and I issue the new ones, you have a grace period and you push back when you start paying. So let's say, just for the sake of argument, Argentina dollarizes in 2024, and at this moment, the Treasury may say, well, these bonds will start to pay in 2026. So I give the government 1 year, 1 year and a half to put its payments in order and see how they're going to pay this. Another option is that you can also extend the payments as much as you need to reduce if you want the yearly payment. So if, rescuing all the LELIQs in 4 years is too much for the Treasury, well, you do it in 6 years, 7 years, 8 years, or whatever you need. So you lower the yearly payment and you extend them in time. Or you do both, right? You postpone the initial payments and you extend for how long you're going to do this. So you have these two variables to help the Treasury also manage its own needed reforms. Now, these US dollar commercial papers, these will be tradable in the secondary market. So if you're a bank in Argentina and you have this paper and you don't want it, you can sell it. You don't have to keep it until maturity. You can sell it if you want. And one option that I will consider is if, when you start this, the discount of this commercial paper is going to be high because Argentina is a mess. But eventually, if you think that the situation is going to be better, even not perfect, but better, you should see that discount, fall. So the value of this paper should increase. So if I'm a large investor, I can say, okay, I want to buy, I don't know, I'm making a number up, $10,000 million of the LELIQs from Argentine banks, and I keep them. So if I'm this Argentina or this trust, I say, okay, Argentine banks have a lot of these liquidity bills. That might be a problem if they need to sell them all at the same time. But I have these investors who is interested in these papers to buy them and hold them because they are betting that they buy them cheap and they collect the full pay of the dollars. So you change from hands from the Argentine banks to international investors who hold the LELIQs. And that can take some pressure out and some concerns out from the Argentine bank.
Okay, well, yes, I see this does get pretty complicated, but I guess that's because this is a real world proposal and this is something you're actually going to do. And I guess Argentina wouldn't need this reform if they weren't in such a dicey situation to begin with.
If the central bank was in better shape, this whole process would be way easier.
Yeah. With the limited time we have left here, Nicolás, can you just speak to, I've heard this question, I've been in various forums since the election results came in, and a lot of people want to know, does Milei need like a parliament to sign off on this, or does he have the authority, if he wants to do this, can he just do it?
Now, I understand that he will need some sort of law by the Congress, and I don't know enough about, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, so I cannot tell you the specifics of what will have to be in the Congress law and what can be done in a different way, where the law delegates to the executive power the details of how to execute something. But at some point, he will need a Congress law to change the legal tender currency of the country or shut down the central bank. What he talked about, and this is where the question may be coming from, is that if Congress doesn't want to approve dollarization, he will do a referendum. So make like ask everyone in Argentina, you want to dollarize, yes or no? And now this referendum doesn't have, like a binding condition where now you have to dollarize according to this way. It's more like a political pressure to Congress saying, hey, the public said they want this. So now you have to do it. So vote the law. So he did mention that. Now he's in the field, right? Now it's game time. So I don't know exactly how he plans to, politically speaking, what the strategy will be to push for dollarization.
Okay, and then maybe just the last question for you here, Nicolás. Economically, do you have any thoughts? Like, suppose they went ahead and did this, with your knowledge of Austrian business cycle theory, is it, and again, I'm relaying this because I've gotten these questions too, and I wasn't sure the right way to think about it. Is it right to think of Argentina right now as being in the midst of an inflationary boom and that there has to be a crash, or is that not the right way to think about it? From an Austrian perspective.
Yeah. The Argentine economy in real terms has been stagnated for more than 10 years. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't describe it as a boom in that sense. So what you have is stagflation with rising inflation. The high risk in Argentina is hyperinflation, an hyperinflation crisis. I don't see the economy in a boom waiting for a bust. The economy is flat. In per capita terms, it's falling. So you have more of like that scenario. Also, the way that money supply is working today in Argentina, when the central bank produces money supply, that's being injected to the market through spending, not through the banking sector through loans, right? It's the injection point is government spending. It's not I give it to the banks, so the bank issue loans at a lower rate. So if I can put in Cantillon effects, right? The injection point is government spending money on stuff. It's not the banks giving loan to long-term projects.
Okay, so just to paraphrase for the listeners, you're making this important distinction that I know Mises and I believe Rothbard made too, that it depends, whether let's say an injection of new money causes the standard Austrian boom-bust cycle. It matters how that money gets into the system. So yes, if it's coming through the credit markets, so like the first prices it distorts are interest rates, then that's what causes the familiar boom-bust cycle. Whereas if it's literally just like a helicopter drop, or if the government's just spending welfare money, building some bridges, buying some tanks, and kind of the money's rippling out in a bunch of different sectors, not all going through the credit markets first, it still is going to obviously dilute purchasing power. And and if you want to talk about it,
the effects are different. Yeah. It's not good,
right?
But the effects are different, and you don't have today in Argentina long-term debt.
You don't have long-term debt.
You cannot get a mortgage. You cannot, take that for 20 years or something like that. That market is not there.
Okay, just because the currency is so unpredictable that no one has that time horizon. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, do you have any? So I guess that means, though, am I to take it that you don't think if they did this sort of shock therapy, there wouldn't necessarily be like a huge crash? That you think they could, the recovery would be quick?
And I don't want to dodge a question, but the devil is in the details.
Right.
Of how the proposal, if it's implemented, it's going to be implemented, how it's announced. You need to provide a lot of certainty. Like it's like you're a patient in horrible status, and you have the surgeon walks into the door, and he needs to give you a kidney transplant, deal with your lungs to make you 3 bypasses all at the same time. I don't need the details of how you're going to do it, but you need to give me confidence. Mm-hmm. So that's what the economic team of this government will have to do. Even if they don't go into the details for the public, they need to transmit a lot of confidence. Now, when we look at what happens in travel countries when they dollarize, the positive shock is so massive that it becomes like the economy, instead of going down, it just starts to go up. So if I have to bet, I will bet if Argentina dollarizes, that's going to be such a positive shock that I will expect a positive result.
Okay, well, great. Well, that's an optimistic note. So, folks, my guest has been Nicolás Cachanosky. Nicolás, thanks so much for your time. Can you tell people where to go to find your work?
Yes, of course. If the easiest way will be my website. If you Google my name, Nicolás Cachanosky, it's going to show up. But it's straightforward. And for Nicolás Cachanosky, my last name. So, ncachanosky.com. Other way to find me, if you are in Twitter and you look for my name, it will show up. And in my bio, or however it's called in Twitter or X, you will have a link to the website as well.
Okay, great. And folks, I'll put links here at the show notes page to get Nicolás's stuff as well. Well, thank you, Nicolás, for your time and the work that, has obviously borne fruit and hopefully will help a lot of people in Argentina and around the world. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. In the meantime, you can find more content like this on Mises.org.